Now, New Zealand's human performance sector, i.e. high-performance sport when it comes to the sports science, as a business is worth about $150 million per year. But there's still a long way to go for the sector to be on par with other New Zealand industries competing on the world stage. Now, coming up shortly at QBE Stadium, there is going to be a forum, and it's an opportunity for people to come along and listen and see products from New Zealand's leading experts, researchers and innovators when it comes to New Zealand sports business. Now, the forum, it's led by the Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development, i.e. AT. It's the 23rd of May, QBE Stadium. And one of those people that will be at the forum is the director and creator of a company called VX Sport, who specialise in collecting athletes' physical data via wearable devices. Now, they've just confirmed a 3-year deal with the All Blacks and Black Ferns. The director is Jamie Telt. He joins us on the program. Jamie, good afternoon. Welcome.
Hey, Mark. How you doing?
Very good, thank you. Tell us a little bit about VX Sport.
Yeah, mate. Well, we've been going since sort of 2007, 2008, and it was a brainchild of Richard Snow, who's an electrical engineer, and Richard's core business is developing solutions for the likes of silver fern farms and wetter workshops and industries that are sort of way outside the sports, stratosphere. He brings sort of the tech talk, and I bring the sports speak to a wearable device that monitors a variety of sports, from rugby to horse racing to surfing and the like. And it was sort of a byproduct of conversations we had during 2007 that we now have devices in about 160 odd teams, 26 countries around the world, and just continues to sort of grow, I guess, in terms of what we can measure. And
what can you measure? What are the high performance measures that you can provide coaches and trainers?
Yeah, it sort of varies. It does definitely vary from sport to sport. The main ones probably 5-6 years ago were all around heart rate and how fast someone runs. Now, it's evolved a hell of a lot since then, because people are understanding now that we're not just collecting information, and that was probably what happened for the first 5 to 7 years of what we did. It was all about information gathering. So there was a million data points per 90 minutes for every athlete. There's a huge amount of data points to go through, and people were simply saying, well, Mark's run 7 Ks in the game and Jamie's ran 6, so Mark must have been working harder. Now, since that time, we've worked out that that's not necessarily the case, and we can now look at things like high-intensity distance. We can look at leg forces. We can look at impact data. We look at jumps. We can break down heart rates into obviously multiple zones and look at a comparison between what's happening in the technical and tactical elements of sport to the physical. There's lots of examples where we might look at how someone's acceleration may influence successful tackle rates, or does it influence their ability to break a line and things like that.
What aspects of VX Sport will the All Blacks be using? What wearable devices? What are they ultimately wanting to measure? And let's talk about firstly the training side of the All Blacks, and then let's talk about what they might be wearing and what they might be looking for during a game, during a test match.
Yeah, sure. I think the All Blacks have got a really good recipe. They've got a philosophy: if it doesn't win games on Saturday, it's probably not worth measuring. And I guess in that regard, they're looking for how can we use that game data to make sure we prepare correctly. And the old adage, we want to train the way we play. So they're looking at the amount of high intensity distance different positions will cover. They're looking for the number of accelerations and decelerations that happen in games. Because we want to do two things. We want to make sure we're exposing the athlete to lots of accelerations and decelerations so they're conditioned to doing it. That reduces the chance of injury. The second side of that is we want to know things like high-intensity distance, because it's important for us to know the absolute hardest periods of play in a game that's going to influence whether or not we can continue our intensity all the way through. And I think that's something we saw with the Black Ferns in the last 12 months or 18 months when during the World Cup cycle, is we know that we had periods in the Black Ferns where we were ebbing and flowing our intensity throughout the game. And when we were able to sustain that intensity consistently throughout the 80 minutes, we found that, funnily enough, in the last 20 minutes, we were able to draw away from other sides or come from behind and win test matches as well.
Mm. In terms of the device itself, I'd imagine that they need to be relatively small, light, Has it been a challenge in terms of the technology, in terms of making it functional for a rugby player out on the sports field so it's not actually interfering with what they're doing?
It's funny you say that, Mark. November last year, we found out that World Rugby had chosen to introduce a specification for all wearable devices in games that had to meet a certain form factor or shape and size. So we were sort of forced into redesigning a unit to make sure it was fit for purpose. And we believe that was always the case, but they decided that the devices, which are like little matchboxes, had to have a certain curvature on their edges. And for us, that was a challenge because most people in the population were after a smaller, a thinner device. And the device we were going to release was actually thin enough that the edges couldn't be round enough to satisfy the criteria. So we had to sort of relook at how we designed the technology. And as you say, it is a challenge to make sure you can fit in all the different types of technology, like your GPS, like your accelerometers, which is essentially the technology in a phone that changes the screen from one side to another. So they can look at different portrait or landscape. We've got gyroscopes looking at rotation. We've got magnetometers and heart rate sensors in there as well. So there's multiple different technologies that need to be squeezed into essentially a 40 to 50 gram device.
I mean, sports science is a great thing, but I think sometimes there is a danger when you sort of try and, I guess, provide an athlete with too much information. And athletes are different. Some are really sports focused or sports science focused and do want all the information. Others, a little bit more sort of she'll be right and just need things basically communicated in a pretty basic way. I mean, what's the message here to coaches? What's the message here in terms of the information that is provided? I mean, what is the best way of disseminating it, or is it just different from athlete to athlete?
No, look, I think it's a fascinating question that we sort of delve into because we're going through a cycle of coaches who had started their coaching careers not using technology to ones who are fully embracing it. Generally speaking, athletes are all in that world. They're all using technology day to day that they want to have a bit of a screenshot of how they are tracking. Our devices themselves can measure about 300 different types of metrics, and so the user can select which they want to use. Within the environments I'm working in currently, we're only usually looking at 4 to 5 things that give us that screenshot of the training or of the game. We're quite selective around which things are going to have an impact on other areas of our program, so whether it's a technical or tactical relationship as well as physical. And we come up with different charts and reports that can get that information back to the coach and engage the coach to the point that they can make training decisions as well, so they can understand what drills have a greater effect on workload compared to other training drills. And then for the athlete themselves, it has an influence over how they might recover or what extras they need to do to try and build up to a load that they require to achieve optimal performance as well. So, yeah, it is a bit of a horses for courses approach, but I think we often like saying we want to avoid paralysis by over-analysis. We want to try and make sure we're only using information that's going to be digestible for us to make good decisions for, again, winning games on Saturday.
Jamie, the big issue facing rugby and rugby league is concussion and just the number of head knocks players can take in a game. Do you have the ability to measure that? Can you provide that sort of information?
There are companies out there, Mark, at the moment looking at concussion specifically, and I think it's still reasonably early days because there's a lot of different variables or things that can influence what those measures look like. So the most accurate sensors currently would be the ones we're seeing in the NFL that can be sitting inside a helmet. And for that reason, there's a few different design limitations that they don't have that we would have in a game of rugby. The sensors that are being trialled in rugby sit behind the ear. And even those sensors do have limitations because often we don't know necessarily where the direction of the impact has come from. We don't necessarily know if there's a direct correlation between how high that impact was to maybe the effects of whiplash or hitting the ground. So it is a bit of a grey area. There is a lot of improvements being made in that technology, but I would say we're still a little way off having a really clear understanding of how that may have a long-term effect on the athlete. There's a lot of unknown.
Jamie, in terms of just the everyday athlete, the everyday weekend warrior across a variety of sports, is VX Sport, are you currently in the market? Do you currently have a product out there for the everyday athlete, or is that the next step with your company?
Yeah, look, we're certainly angling in that direction. We have something that you'll see with the Blackburns and All Blacks and New Zealand Māori and the 20s all using, and they're using a high-end device that offers live transmission back to coaches' cellular phones. At the other end of the scale, we're also working with secondary schools where we have a more basic device, but it's still designed with all the same types of hardware components. And the way we're using that in schools is actually to use data to teach. We're saying to the bursary rugby player, who may not go on to be a professional rugby player, but there are career options out there now for those girls and guys. So they can look at their data up on a screen, develop quite complex mathematical or scientific equations, and because it's their data, we can use sports data to teach math and science and even English to high school students. So that sort of end of device, that's available for the weekend warrior, and I'm sure going forward we'll have something that's even more affordable.
Your company, VX Sport, are you world leaders? Are you getting interest from overseas here?
4 years ago, we probably did nothing in the US, and now it makes up over 40% of what we do. So I think we've got a couple of big boys in the game that we compete against, and competition's good. It keeps driving us to be better. And I think I could rattle off a number of New Zealand companies that are not dissimilar in that vein. We've got guys like Stretch Sense and Circaband who have really recently come together. Stretch Sense effectively measure in a fabric type technology how fast things can contract. They measure angles. They've been inserted now in strength bands, which are an everyday piece of gym equipment from a company out of Christchurch called Circaband. They've come together to push their technologies together. You've got guys like Ian Taylor, Animation Research in Dunedin, and they are world leaders. You've got AD Instruments, who again look at movement profiling of athletes, and the list goes on. And all of us here in New Zealand, like you said in your intro, we're part of a probably $150 million a year industry, which is small in the scheme of things, but literally we're only scratching 2, 3, 4% of the actual market at the moment. So I'm sure the future looks rosy.
Jamie, I just want to ask you this, because everybody's been aware of heart rate monitors, and heart rate's become something that I think everyday people do measure, and now GPS, obviously accuracy around distance. What do you think the next step is? Where's going to be that next big trend? Is there a basic measurement that people are going to look to in terms of monitoring performance, or have we pretty much summed it up with heart rate and GPS? No,
look, again, mate, I think we're a long way behind in terms of how data actually works together, cohesive analysis of data. And another company like Dot Labs Data out of Wellington, they're bringing different data sets together. So we want to know, how does heart rate affect high intensity distance and those types of things. And I think at the forum, one thing you're going to see from Indira Negi from Intel's Olympic program, they're looking at virtual reality, and we're looking at Nicholas James coming out. He looks at neural networks and artificial intelligence solutions. I think they're the two hot topics at the moment we're seeing, three hot topics. We're seeing looking for cohesive relationships in data, we're looking at virtual reality, and we're looking at AI or machine-learned algorithms. I think all those types of things are going to add to the melting pot the next few years. And the guys at Performance Lab up in Auckland, who are also working with Intel, they're some of their big topics at the moment. They're looking at VR and AI and all those nice acronyms that we tend to throw out there. But I do believe that we're still on the upward curve in terms of where the technology is going to go.
Okay, Jamie Tout, Director of Creator VX Sport. You are going to be a keynote speaker at the Sports Forum. Why should people get tickets? Why should people go along?
It's a really good opportunity to see from both a business and a sporting perspective what sort of technologies are out there and how they're actually working together. And that is going to be the subject of myself and Ken Shippanen from High Performance Sport New Zealand. He is a sports scientist at the All Blacks and has worked for Team New Zealand in the past. What we're talking about on the day is how do we bring different technologies together? How can they complement each other? How do we avoid that paralysis by analysis? And ultimately, again, how do we win games on Saturday? So I think that from the sports perspective, but also from a business perspective, there's a lot of reasons to get out to the forum on the 23rd, and it'd be great to see a lot of people out there.